There's a receipt sitting in a lot of people's kitchen drawers right now that they haven't looked at twice. It's from 6 months ago. And if they pulled it out and compared it to what the same cart costs today, the difference wouldn't just be noticeable, it would be uncomfortable. Here's the part almost nobody's talking about. Economists tracking this year's tariff rollout have said something specific. The full impact hasn't hit shelves yet. It's sitting in a pipeline right now, moving through shipping contracts, processing plants, and distributor warehouses, and it's set to land between spring and fall of this year, which means the prices you're paying in August are not the prices you'll be paying by the time the leaves start turning. This isn't a video about panic buying. It's not about hoarding toilet paper or clearing out a store shelf while a camera crew films the chaos for the evening news. It's about 12 specific items where the math already points in one direction, where waiting doesn't save money, it costs it. Some of these have shelf lives measured in years, which means buying now isn't even really a sacrifice. It's just moving a purchase you were going to make anyway to a moment when it's cheaper. Some are getting hit by tariffs, stacked directly on top of supply shortfalls, stacked on top of weather disasters most people never heard about happening on the other side of the planet. What makes this year different from a normal round of grocery inflation is the timing. Analysts tracking tariff pass-through have been explicit that businesses absorbed most of the cost increases through 2025 to avoid scaring off price-sensitive shoppers, eating the difference in their own margins instead of passing it along. That cushion is running out right now. Once retailers start repricing, the increases tend to stick permanently because grocery pricing almost never moves back down once it's gone up. That's not speculation, that's a well-documented pattern in how retail pricing actually behaves. Stay to the end, because number one is the item every single grocery economist keeps circling back to when they talk about what's coming next. Quick thing before we get into it. If you've ever opened your pantry looking for something specific and found 5 things you forgot you already had, you're not alone, and that's actually part of the problem this list solves. Drop a like if you want more of these breakdowns, and subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the next price shift, instead of reacting to it after it's already on the shelf tag. Now, let's get into it. Number 12, coffee. This one isn't a maybe, it's already happened once and is set up to happen again. Consumer coffee prices hit a record above $9 a pound earlier this year, a jump of more than 30% from 12 months prior, and packaged ground coffee at one point posted its fastest single-year increase in almost 3 decades. 2 things collided to cause it. First, back-to-back weather disasters in Brazil and Vietnam, the 2 countries that grow the majority of the world's coffee supply between them, cut yields hard in successive seasons. Second, tariffs on Brazilian imports piled directly on top of that shortage, in some cases adding 50% on top of a green bean price that had already doubled. Analysts have pointed out something important here. Because of how long it takes raw beans to move through contracts, shipping, and roasting schedules before reaching a shelf, the price shocks from earlier this year are still working their way toward consumers, with some estimates putting that lag at close to 9 months. Buy shelf-stable ground or whole bean coffee now, store it sealed in an opaque container away from heat, and you're effectively locking in today's price against a curve that hasn't finished climbing. Number 11, beef. This is the one ranchers, economists, and grocery analysts all agree on without much argument. The national cattle herd has fallen to its smallest size since 1951, and the breeding cow herd specifically is at its lowest point since 1961. Not since the pandemic, not since the last recession, since Eisenhower was president. Years of drought across the southern plains forced ranchers to sell off breeding stock they couldn't afford to feed, and rebuilding a herd isn't like restocking a shelf overnight. It takes 2 to 3 years minimum before a newly bred calf even becomes market-ready beef, which means today's shortage is essentially locked, and regardless of what happens with prices from here. Retail beef has already crossed $9 a pound in composite pricing, and USDA forecasts point to continued increases through the rest of this year, with the American Farm Bureau suggesting meaningful relief may not arrive until closer to 2028. If your freezer has room, ground beef, roasts, and steaks all freeze well for 8 to 12 months without a meaningful drop in quality, which makes this one of the more straightforward buy-ahead decisions on the entire list. The US now applies a 15% base tariff on agricultural imports from Italy and the broader European Union, covering olive oil directly. and that's stacked on top of a Mediterranean region already dealing with repeated drought and extreme heat, cutting into harvests for several years running. Spain, Italy, and Greece together produce the large majority of the world's olive oil supply, and when their yields drop at the same time an import tariff goes up, there isn't much room left for the shelf price to stay where it is. Unlike fresh produce, olive oil has real, predictable shelf life when stored properly, generally 18 to 24 months in a dark glass bottle kept away from heat and direct light. Buying the larger bottle now instead of replacing a small one every few weeks is one of the more mathematically obvious moves on this entire list, since the per ounce savings compound the more you buy at once. This one is oddly precise, almost surgical in how narrowly it targets one product category. 13 of Italy's largest pasta exporters are now facing an additional anti-dumping duty layered on top of the existing base tariff, pushing the combined rate on some brands to somewhere around 107%. That's not a typo, and it's not a rounding error either. If there's a specific imported pasta brand your household genuinely prefers over a domestic substitute, this is the season to buy several boxes instead of one, because some of these products may simply become unaffordable at retail or disappear from shelves entirely, rather than absorb a markup of that size. Domestic pasta brands made from American-grown wheat aren't caught in this particular tariff structure. So this is really about protecting access to one specific import category, not pasta as a food group broadly. USDA's own food price outlook specifically flagged sugar and sweets as the fastest rising grocery category this year, with forecasts putting the increase well above 6%, faster than that category's 20-year historical average. That doesn't just mean the plain sugar bag on the baking aisle. It quietly touches baking supplies, syrups, jams, cereal, and anything built around a long ingredient list that leans on sweeteners as a base cost. A 5 or 10 pound bag of granulated sugar stores almost indefinitely when kept dry, sealed, and away from moisture. So there's very little practical downside to buying ahead, specifically on this one, especially compared to categories where storage life is the limiting factor. Number 7, canned tomatoes. Mexico supplies the majority of fresh tomatoes sold in the US, and tariffs on Mexican agricultural imports have pushed costs up across that entire supply relationship, canned versions included, since much of the tomato crop destined for canning also moves through that same cross-border trade route. A case of canned tomatoes is genuinely inexpensive today, holds well for over a year in a cool, dry pantry, and forms the base of more weeknight meals, sauces, and soups than almost anything else sitting on a grocery shelf. When the fresh version gets noticeably more expensive, the canned version becomes the fallback everyone reaches for, and fallback items are exactly the ones worth having stocked before that shift happens rather than after. If you're finding this genuinely useful, this is a good spot to hit subscribe, because part 2 covers the 2 items that price analysts are calling the biggest wildcards of the entire second half of this year, and you don't want to miss those. Also, drop a comment with which one of the first 6 surprised you most. I actually read these, and it shapes what gets covered in future breakdowns. Number 6, avocados and Mexican produce broadly. Wholesale avocado prices have already climbed close to 20% since new tariffs on Mexican imports took effect, and the same pressure is showing up on limes, bell peppers, mangoes, and winter berries. The exact produce items the U.S. relies on Mexico for during months when domestic growing regions in California and Florida are dormant. Mexico supplies roughly half of the fresh fruit and close to 70% of the fresh vegetables sold in U.S. grocery stores, which is a large enough share that a tariff on that relationship shows up almost immediately at the produce counter. Fresh produce obviously doesn't store the way pantry goods do, so the strategy here isn't stockpiling avocados in a garage. It's buying a little more consistently right now while stores are still working through earlier, lower-cost inventory and leaning toward domestic and in-season produce where a reasonable substitute exists. Number 5, butter and dairy fat. Dairy overall has stayed noticeably more stable than beef so far, which is genuinely good news, but butter specifically draws on some of the same constrained cattle and feed economics, pushing up beef prices, since dairy cattle numbers and feed costs move along many of the same input curves. Butter also happens to be one of the easiest pantry items to freeze, without any real quality trade-off, holding its texture and flavor for close to a year with almost no noticeable difference once thawed and softened. If you bake regularly, or just go through butter quickly in a busy household, buying an extra block or two when it's on sale and tucking it in the freezer is one of the lowest effort, lowest risk moves on this entire list. Number 4. Canned and frozen seafood. Seafood has been flagged as one of the food categories posting some of the largest month-to-month increases this year, and a meaningful share of the seafood sold in U.S. grocery stores, from shrimp to canned tuna to farmed salmon, is imported, which puts the category directly in the path of ongoing tariff adjustments, the same way coffee and cocoa have been. Canned tuna and salmon in particular hold their nutritional value, texture, and flavor for years sitting in a pantry, unlike fresh seafood, which spoils in days, and that difference alone makes canned seafood one of the easier categories to simply buy ahead on without ever worrying about waste. Number 3. White rice. This one is less about a sudden spike and more about a long, quiet, recurring pattern worth understanding. Rice is a genuinely global commodity, and export restrictions from several major rice-producing countries, combined with weather disruption across parts of Southeast Asia, have already caused sharp, short-term price spikes more than once in recent years, and commodity analysts continue to flag rice as vulnerable to that same pattern, repeating with very little warning. What makes rice worth including here specifically, beyond the commodity risk, is how disproportionately well it stores compared to almost anything else in a grocery cart. Properly sealed white rice can hold its quality for decades in the right conditions, which makes buying a larger bag now feel less like a grocery purchase and more like locking in a price years in advance. Number 2, spices and vanilla. This is the category people forget about until they're standing in the baking aisle, wondering why a small bottle of vanilla extract suddenly costs noticeably more than it used to. Vanilla, cinnamon, and a long list of specialty spices are grown almost exclusively outside the US, concentrated in regions like Madagascar and Indonesia, which means the entire category is fully exposed to both tariff policy and the same kind of weather-driven supply disruption that's already hit larger commodities like coffee and cocoa this year. These are low-volume, low-dollar purchases individually, so buying a few extra bottles now barely registers against a normal grocery budget. But doing it protects against a category that tends to jump sharply and without much advance notice when a single growing region has a bad season. Number 1, cocoa and chocolate. This is the item price analysts keep circling back to whenever this topic comes up, and for good reason. Cocoa is grown almost entirely in a handful of West African countries, and crop disease combined with adverse weather in that region has already pushed global cocoa prices to multi-year highs over the past couple of seasons. That pressure sits directly on top of the rising sugar costs covered earlier, since virtually every chocolate product on a shelf combines both ingredients at once, meaning chocolate absorbs 2 separate inflation trends simultaneously rather than one. Baking chocolate, cocoa powder, and most shelf-stable chocolate products all store well for extended periods in a cool, dry pantry away from heat. Given that both of its core ingredients, cocoa and sugar, are already flagged as the 2 fastest-moving categories in this year's entire food price outlook, this is arguably the single item on the list with the least room left before the next price jump shows up on the shelf tag. If this list changed how you're thinking about your next grocery trip, that's genuinely the point of making it. Hit like if even one of these 12 surprised you, and subscribe so the next breakdown lands in your feed before the price is due instead of after. None of this requires clearing a shelf or filling a garage with pallets of canned goods. It's smaller than that. It's a slightly bigger bag of rice this month, an extra block of butter in the freezer, 2 bottles of olive oil instead of 1. Small, boring decisions that don't feel dramatic in the moment, made a few months before the price tag catches up to where the market's already heading. Picture the version of this that actually plays out. September arrives, prices move the way analysts have been forecasting for months, and somewhere a family opens their pantry and finds exactly what they need already sitting there, bought at a price that no longer exists. That's not luck. That's just paying attention a little earlier than everyone else. Which of these 12 is missing from your pantry right now? Drop it in the comments, and if you want the next one before it happens, instead of after, you already know what to do. See you in the next one.